What's up, everybody? I hope that George enjoys his theme song. So you want to get right to the core. So you want to know what it's all for. So you want to come off knowing more. Well, you better get hip. The podcast by George. So you want to get straight to the show. So you want to know what you need to know. You want to know what we're all here for. Well, you better get hip. The podcast by George. Podcast by George. Podcast by George. He knows what he's fighting for. It's podcast by George. Podcast by George. Want to know what we're fighting for?
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back to a podcast by George. It's something I've been waiting for. It's Chris McGreal with The Guardian, the foreign correspondent for that paper, which is funny to me because the foreign land that he's reporting on, it's us, folks. And I mean, that really has a lot to do with the subject today. There's an old Bo Diddley song. It's Before You Accuse Me, Take a Look at Yourself. You maybe remember Eric Clapton doing that song, and it was originally done by Bo Diddley back in 1957. And when I talk to Chris, that's what I'm thinking about all the time. I tell folks, if you want to know what you really look like, don't look in the mirror. That might be the worst thing you can do, is get your own opinion of what you look like. Don't go to your spouse or your family to get an opinion. They probably don't like you very much. It might be worse than you think. Go to an impartial third-party observer, somebody you don't even know, and say, hey, you know, what do I look like today? You're probably going to get a better, more honest opinion. And that's what I think about our buddy here, Chris McGreal. Before we get going, I want to read his bio to start with, but I want to thank some folks here, which I forget to do on the podcast. The open of the show, you hear music a lot of times. Recently, you've heard Ron Placone. He's the guy with the acoustic guitar doing that original podcast by George song. I mean, a lot of people have commented on that. I really like it. He does it in the kind of a punk style. It's just cool. And Ron's a nationally known comedian. He's been on the Young Turks. He's a regular on the Jimmy Dore show, as an example. And he volunteered to do that. So, I mean, I just think that's great. Bob Pace does a lot of the opens with that song. And then when you hear music to open with, a lot of times that's Desharm Jones and Matt Woods, and you'll see those CDs on the library shelf behind me. And then the announcer, the big booming voice that introduces the show, that's John Schaefer from We Are Iowa, Television 5 sports director here in the Heartland. And, of course, he's on my men's league hockey team, too. He's back there on defense, making me about 6 inches taller because nobody messes with you when Big John's back there. So thanks to John Schaefer. And then lastly, the thing that I want to mention today, this painting, a lot of people have commented on it behind me. Carol Hartman did this. She's a friend of mine. She's in Montana. A lot of people think that's an Iowa scene, but it's not. It's actually out of the big sky country up there. Carol's an outstanding artist, and she does a lot of landscapes. This one, I bought this little painting, and a portion of it went to a food bank. She's very conscious. It's just great stuff. Go on Facebook or Google Carol Hartman, artist, and you'll find that. And the stuff is reasonably priced. It came in a frame. God, it's just great. So anyway, that's a little bit of stuff that I've been neglecting to get to before we get to Chris. Okay, Chris McGreal. Who's Chris McGreal? As I mentioned, he's the foreign correspondent for The Guardian. The guy's covered Africa, the Middle East, and Central America. He's now based in the U.S. That's what we're going to be talking about today. He won awards for his coverage of Africa, Israel, and here in the U.S. I always like this. He's a former merchant seaman. He began his career in journalism in 1982 with the BBC local radio. He worked as a producer at the BBC World Service in London before moving to Venezuela in 1985. Keep your eyes on Venezuela, folks. The United States wants Venezuela. We've talked about that before. They got all that oil down there, and I just got a feeling we're going to have to give them some democracy real soon on the point of a spear, because that's the way that we do it, and it seems to coincide a lot with countries that have natural resources. Venezuela, keep an eye on them. And as a reporter on the English language Daily Journal in Caracas, and as a correspondent for the BBC. Now, also, he's the author of American Overdose. We did an entire show on that not too long ago. The Opioid Tragedy in 3 acts, published by Public Affairs in the U.S. and Guardian Faber in the UK. And that crisis ain't going away anytime soon. Chris McGreal, welcome back to another podcast by George.
Thanks, George. Great to be here.
You know, before we leave the American overdose topic, wasn't there something with the Sacklers? Did one of the patriarchs of that family pass away? What's the latest on that?
Yeah, one of the patriarchs passed away. The family itself right now is basically fighting to hang on to at least some of the billions it made out of pushing OxyContin on people who didn't need it. At the moment, what we're waiting to see is what the judge in the case essentially decides on the proposed bankruptcy of Purdue Pharma and the contribution that the family itself has to make to the final settlement. The family is estimated to have made somewhere around $13 to $15 billion out of this drug, out of OxyContin, a very powerful opioid that was prescribed to lots of people who really didn't need it, and which kick-started the whole opioid epidemic 20 years ago. They are we don't know the exact numbers, but they are offering to pay only a fraction of that. And one of the arguments that they're putting forward is they're trying to now deny that OxyContin caused the opioid epidemic at all. There's a whole PR campaign going on with their PR firms and lawyers pushing the idea that because OxyContin was only a small percentage of the overall painkiller market, it couldn't possibly have caused this epidemic, when of course the significance of the drug was it was extremely powerful, extremely easy to get hooked on and to misuse, and most importantly it was marketed like it was aspirin, and that was undoubtedly Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sacklers, that did that. So we'll see if they're able to worm their way out of this one.
Well, I know you'll stay on it. It's a different subject, but it does have some interesting correlations about how I started. Because, again, you're a Brit, and you were aware of this problem, and then you come over to the United States and take a look at this and go, oh, my God. I mean, this is, it's not restricted solely to the United States, but the problem that we have with that is unprecedented in history, probably. And it's just kind of shocking for people to look at us and see the depth of the despair and the problem with the opioid epidemic. Well, okay, but we have limited time, so I got to get to what we wanted to talk about today. And it was this most recent article. Now, you're moving around in the heartland, and you've been down in Missouri, and you've been up in Iowa covering politics, and really just kind of looking at it is the way that I put it. And this headline in The Guardian reads, "This is unstoppable. America's Midwest braces itself for a COVID-19 surge." And of course, experts are predicting an increase in deaths across the region, made significantly worse by lawmakers who question the value of face coverings. And that was driven home just this week. Chris, as you probably know, Iowa surpassed 1,000 COVID deaths officially. How they're tracking and counting that, subject to dispute. Could be worse than that, actually, but over 1,000 officially. One day this week, we had 16 deaths in a single day. And to get us started here, the point that I'm making to people is, folks, this is supposed to be the trough. This is supposed to be the bottom. We were supposed to kind of be like flu season this time of year. How many people died of everybody says this is like the flu. Well, how many cases of flu and how many people died of flu in the state of Iowa one day this week? It wasn't 16, folks. I mean, we're not under control here in the summertime lull, and the fall and the winter is coming. And some of these experts, Chris, are saying that these totals could double, maybe even triple, according to how we respond between now and Christmas time.
Yeah, that's right. And it was said, as you correctly say, that there was going to kind of be a lull and then a second wave, and it's almost as though we never got the lull, and yet the second wave is still coming. I mean, the United States is such an enormous country that obviously it's moved around. We had that huge concentration in New York, and then Florida and Texas get hit. Now, partly that's just geography. It spreads around the country much, as it did Europe, for instance. If you take Europe as a whole rather than as individual countries, then you can see it move. It begins in Italy and it moves on. Then it's really bad in Spain, and now the worst hit country has been Britain. But there's no denying that it's also down to policies. You see in places such as Florida that the lifting of the restrictions greatly contributed to the spread. All those people on the beach suddenly at spring break. You see in Texas that the governor there, Greg Abbott, questioning the value of wearing masks and again easing the lockdown much earlier than many of the experts would have advised. And then suddenly a surge, and suddenly Greg Abbott says wear a mask, but by then it's much too late. And of course, the great concern is that's what's coming to the Midwest. Is that if you look at Missouri, you see the governor there, Tim Parson, lifted the lockdown quite early in May, and then goes to a hardware store, and he's asked by a reporter in a hardware store, "Governor, why aren't you wearing a mask?" And his answer is, "I'm not going to let the government tell me what to do." And of course, that pushed a very mixed message, as has the president. You've seen it with your own Governor Reynolds in Iowa. And this mixed messaging has really opened the door to people who just say, well, I don't want to wear a mask, I don't feel like it, or they come up with all kinds of other arguments. I mean, some of the arguments go as far as saying there isn't even a pandemic, that these numbers are all fixed. I heard up in Wisconsin people saying that the death toll was fixed by hospitals who were claiming people died of COVID-19 when they'd actually died of something else because they get payments for that. Now you have to imagine the size of the conspiracy there, that all the hospitals in the country are parting there, and nobody has blown the whistle to imagine that's true. But people are believing what they want to believe in some cases, and of course I think that is facilitated by those politicians who question the value. Up in Wisconsin, where I just was, the governor there did push. He did impose mandatory masks indoors, and you saw a whole bunch of sheriffs, nearly 20 sheriffs, county sheriffs, simply say, "We're not going to enforce that. It's unconstitutional, or it's not our business." So instantly saying that, well, if you don't want to wear a mask, don't wear a mask. And so I think that's the concern now, that is coming to the Midwest.
Well, these statistics are shocking. The United States has 4% of the population. We have 25% of the cases reported thus far, 22% of the deaths that we have here. And of course, why is this happening? Well, the other thing that we have here, like nobody else almost, politics. My God, the politics that we have and the role that it plays in all of this. And religion has something to do with it, maybe not necessarily organized religion, but this idea of me versus we that some societies and countries have, which we don't seem to have very much of here in the United States. We tend to think about ourselves. And as I mentioned at the top, Chris, you're this roving foreign correspondent. You've been all over the world. You've won awards. To do that, you have to be a little bit of a historian also. And again, I get back to this UK thing. I look at it and I think, one of the big differences about the United States is we don't like being told what to do. That's kind of how we became a country. We didn't want to be told what to do. I look over at the Brits, and I mean, they were in World War II. I mean, they were in danger of losing it. I mean, it looked like you were going to lose it. They did have to pull together. It did have to be we, not me, or you guys might not even have none of us have a country at this point in time. How much of that do you think plays a role in this?
Well, if you look at Britain now, it has the worst, the highest death rate in Europe, and per capita, it's higher than the United States. So it's not a good example, actually. I think we have a conservative government in Britain. Boris Johnson is very much an individualist and very much of the idea that the government shouldn't interfere in people's lives. They also, to some degree, bought into the idea of herd immunity. If you could build up herd immunity, then ultimately there would be fewer infections and fewer deaths. They retreated from that when they were warned by the heads of the National Health Service, amongst others, that the hospitals would be so overwhelmed by the number of people who became infected that, in fact, many more people would die. So they retreated from that. But what it meant was that Britain was very late compared to other European countries like France and Germany to lock down. And that delay of a week or two actually had a very large impact. So in that sense, Britain's, somewhere between Europe and the United States. There's certainly more authority. The government has more, persuasion powers than perhaps in the United States, but it's not as firmly in control, say, as in somewhere like France. People did stay at home. I think there was far less questioning of the science in Britain. I mean, it's why you haven't seen other anti-vaccination campaigns really take off in quite the same way in Britain as they have in the United States. People tend to listen to the science and listen to the experts. But the scale of the lockdown hit the economy bad. Lots of people lost their jobs. There was again more government involvement in that. In the UK, the government paid up to 80% of your salary if you were furloughed. So that cushioned the blow for a lot of people. That helped, get people to obey the lockdown. But even so, it has spread. So I think that old World War II thing of all pulling together in great danger, there's still an element of it left. But I guess since the years of Margaret Thatcher, there's a lot more individualism as well. Like I say, Britain in many ways it straddles, both the United States and Europe in those kind of attitudes, I think.
Yeah, I think you've assimilated some of our worst qualities when it comes.
Well, I think that they were always there, and I think that's perhaps, that individualism is partly, certainly if you look back to the time of American independence, that was certainly a quality that was the rest of Europe looked at Britain for. To be honest, it was partly why Britain was a home for people like Karl Marx for many years, that it did tolerate that individualism and alternative views where most of Europe didn't. So, it comes and goes in waves, I'd say.
What's your take or your perspective on our governor here in Iowa? You mentioned Wisconsin. I know you've been down there in Missouri. Iowa's actually got a very high rate of infections. We're not doing very well in this state. She's been reluctant to enforce a mandatory mask wearing here in this state. What do you see and what do you hear when you focus solely on Iowa?
Well, I think you do see what you see in some other states, which is the politics at work, as you said. I mean, it's hard to think that this isn't at least partly about politics. Her objections to masks are not backed by the science. She's been told by various studies, including one out of the University of Washington, that without the masks, by the end of the year, probably instead of 3 or 4 deaths a day from coronavirus, you're going to have around 12, 13, 14 in the state. So there's a big difference. So the evidence is all there in favor of masks. The question is why she doesn't support it, why she won't make them mandatory. It's hard to avoid the fact that this is politics. She's a Republican. It plays well with a section of Republican voters. And you see exactly the same thing in Missouri. You saw it in Texas. I think in this case, the division is between those Republican governors in other parts of the country who have followed the science and do seem to have been able to contain to some degree. Now, I suppose the big question is what the voters will make of it, particularly if the Midwest does get hit very badly through the fall and into the winter. Will they regard Governor Reynolds and the other Republican governors who've been wishy-washy on the issues of masks, refuse to make them mandatory, will they regard them as having been negligent, and will there be a backlash, particularly if people start dying in significant numbers? I'm not sure. I mean, you look at the president, he's clearly suffered in the polls because of his questioning, because of his handling, partly because of his chaotic press conferences about the pandemic. And some of that must surely also kind of have a knock-on effect, I would have thought, for the governors that have followed his lead.
Well, I'm a big critic of Governor Reynolds, obviously, on the podcast. Not a fan at all on a lot of fronts, and on this one in particular. But if I had to, it always comes down to, are they too dumb or are they in on it? And so I think she's mostly in on it. But if I'd have to say that she's too dumb, I see this angle. There's so much in this country now. People are confusing democracy and just social living in society with capitalism. They believe that everything we are, that the very foundation of this country, the bedrock upon which we're founded are none of the things that you'll find in the history books. It's business. It's corporatism. And they don't want to do anything that will adversely affect the flow of business in this country. And a shutdown, a lockdown, does that. Now, some of these other countries around the world, everybody has to do business. Capitalism is a part of a lot of these countries, but they consider the well-being of themselves and their neighbors and their friends and relatives and whatever in that equation as well. We tend not to do that so much. Do you see that in other parts of the world?
Well, I think, one of the problems here is, as I was saying earlier, this is such a large country. And if you look at the Midwest, you had that surge in infections and deaths in New York, and that's when the lockdowns begin. But if you were living in the Midwest and you'd lost your job, the infection and death rate was relatively low through most of the lockdown. And there were lots of people who understandably said at that point, is the cure worse than the disease? And of course, people losing their jobs, people being, losing their incomes and being driven into poverty also claims lives. That does have a knock-on effect. There's no doubt about that. And so, I can understand why people wondered whether the entire country was being locked down because New York was in a bad way. And I think that's obviously exacerbated by the fact that most European countries had provided some kind of cushion, some kind of safety net for people who lost their jobs. Like I was saying, in Britain, you got 80% of your salary from the government. That clearly wasn't happening here. The $1,200 payment only goes so far for a lot of people. And then, I heard time and time again that the unemployment was a very long time coming. And people were really struggling to pay their bills. So I can understand why, when businesses started saying, listen, we need to open up again, you can understand why the politicians felt that pressure. And I can understand why ordinary people backed it. I mean, I think one of the other problems here has been, again, I think we have to look at the very top and the mixed messaging, is that people haven't necessarily taken on board that you wear masks to protect other people. That message hasn't been strongly pushed. The idea that I'm putting myself at risk if I don't wear a mask, and it's none of your business if I want to risk my life. And I compare it to drinking and driving. You might say, it's my business if I get drunk and drive a car. And you go, well, it is until you slam into that family of four and wipe them out. And I think that's what hasn't been perhaps, emphasized in the United States to the same degree that it has in other countries, is that you're doing this to protect other people, not just yourself.
Well, the other thing that we have going on in this country, which is unlike most of the countries that aren't the third world, is healthcare. It's tied to employment here. People lose their jobs in an economic lockdown and a crisis like this. They lose their healthcare. That may be the next shoe to drop. And again, that's different from a lot of the EU and in the UK as well, because they keep 80% of their income, but they also keep their health care, right?
Yeah, so healthcare is provided, in Britain, it's provided by the state, it's socialized. So it's not in any way attached to your job. If, you're a legal resident of Britain, you've got healthcare, end of story. If you go into a hospital, you don't even get asked about any form of payment because it's free at the point of delivery, as they say. Other countries like Germany and France, you pay a kind of top up, you do have an insurance, but again, it's delivered to everybody no matter what. You're not asked to prove. And of course, they don't have this rather strange system of in-network and out-of-network and et cetera, and co-pays and deductibles and all these kind of complications, which, people are finding. This is of course the other issue, is that if people are feeling sick, some people simply feel they can't afford to go to the hospital and get seen to. I spoke to people who said, if I get sick, I'm just going to stay home and hope to come out the other side, because I cannot afford a $20,000 bill or whatever it might be, whatever their deductible might be, for treatment. And on top of that, you have the lack of testing and tracing. Now, depending on where you are, getting a test is actually really quite difficult. And in some places, hospitals have been charging a reasonable amount for a test, but then loading loads of other fees on top of that. For instance, if you go to the emergency room to get a test, you pay $100 for a test, you find yourself with another $1,000 bill for having walked into the emergency room. The New York Times had a long story on this yesterday, but I'd heard it from other people, all of which discourage people from finding out if they've even got the virus, which then contributes to the risk of it spreading.
Well, I encourage people to follow Chris in The Guardian. Check out his most recent article here as he takes a look at the Midwest and the coronavirus. And I don't know, I'm looking forward to your next series of reports coming out of the heartland here, Chris. And of course, just in the past week or so, this crazy derecho, 140-mile-an-hour winds now, they say, were clocked in eastern Iowa. Just like with all of the weather occurrences that we're seeing, historic, unprecedented, unbelievable. These stories just come and come. And of course, it's all related to climate. It's climate crisis. There's no doubt about it. You again, being in Europe and coming over here and looking at how we are responding to the climate and to these weather occurrences has to be on the level of bizarre as well.
Well, I think, people in Europe tend to wonder why people in the United States question science, I suppose. And we see it with COVID-19 with some people, and vaccinations in general. And obviously the climate crisis is another such issue. And I think it remains a mystery to lots of people in say, Europe, why America remains in denial. And I think most people would put it in the perspective that you did earlier, which is about business. Business interests are not, have an interest, shall we say, in not following the science. They don't want the regulation or to take the measures on pollution that help control the increases in temperature, and that's just how the United States is. But yes, people in other countries do find it somewhat bizarre. I try to explain to them that Americans come from a very different place with a different history and a different attitude towards government, and you see that manifest itself in many ways that have actually made America the great country that it is. There's a lot of individualism here, which fuels the energy and the can-do spirit that America is renowned for. But it does have downsides at times,
Well, I'll leave it there. Maybe close my portion here with another famous musician of more modern era, maybe a singer-songwriter, Don Henley. Now, maybe it's an old saying, but he had it in one of his songs. He said, there's no luggage racks on hearses. I mean, people need to consider that, and that's kind of what we're looking at here. I mean, we've got to protect American business and capitalism and that type of thing, but you can't take it with you, folks. It won't do you any good if you don't survive. Well, Chris, give you the last word here, maybe a preview on what you're going to do next, if you know, or anything that you want to talk about that you've covered to date.
Well, the first in my latest series of articles going between swing counties in the United States in the Midwest has come out today. It's from Howard County up in northeastern Iowa, where I hear from farmers who voted for Obama twice, voted for Trump, and going to vote for Trump again, and other people in the town of Cresco, actually. Talking about how they regard Trump, what is going on. The Republican chair, the chair of the county Republican Party there, tells me he thinks Trump's in big trouble in that part of the world. And he laments, in his words, that Americans have such a poor choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. He might be a Republican, but he doesn't think it's a great choice in November either way. So that's what I've been writing about. The next articles from Michigan, and then after that from Wisconsin, looking at how the president's support is or isn't holding up. That's great. We'll look for it. And again, I'll trust that. I mean, I'll read that closely, because that's not coming from a partisan. That's coming from somebody that's an impartial third party that doesn't have any skin in the game. I mean, that's the way you want to look at this. I'm not looking for a mirror. Now, I'm left of the Democratic Party, so I get some of my news from there. But what I'm really looking for in my journalism is a window.
And Chris McGreal's a win. I don't want a mirror. I don't want to see reflected back to me what I say, and I want to see what somebody else says that's got a clear and accurate perspective of what's going on. That's Chris McGreal, folks. He's the foreign correspondent for The Guardian, and his assignment, his foreign country that he's covering, is us. And I hope you like Podcast by George. If you do, please go to podcastbygeorge.com. Click on a badge there. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's on iTunes or Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, or Facebook. A lot of people follow us on Facebook. But that's going to wrap it up for today. That's all there is. There ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.